As we learned yesterday, there are four observational skills that we need to perfect and grow in to become better painters. We have to be able to see shapes better, viewpoints, we have to render value more accurately, while also mixing the accurate color to have our paintings look three-dimensional and to show depth. To make these three-dimensional forms, we have to make sure we are painting in the value shapes in layers, just like our still life, by putting the light values in first and slowly building up to the darker values. So what you're seeing on the right, that is what we're going to be achieving today. Your first step, whenever you begin a new painting, is always choose your color scheme. As we stated before, we're going to be mixing blues, greens, and purples because we are copying this river scene on the left from the book Watercolor Techniques for Artists and Illustrators. Our colors will slightly vary as we have different hues to mix than the artist used for that particular painting. However, the general colors and more importantly, the value of these colors will be placed in the same areas. So now that we know that we're doing this cool color scheme of blues, greens, and purples, our second step is to analyze our colors. Anytime you're beginning a new painting, you always want to look for the properties of colors in the different painted sections that you see. For example, this back right cluster of trees is lighter in value, and the intensities of these colors are way less intense than the trees that we're seeing in front of it. Notice that those trees have a light to mid value range, and the colors are much brighter than the trees back here because the artist wants those trees to jump forward. It's moving closer to us in the picture plane. You'll see that dull, diluted tints of colors recede back into the distance, where these more brighter, darker colors seem to sit forward in the composition. Same thing here with the grass that we're seeing in the very front. This grass is a lot darker in value than the two tree sections behind it. And because it's a darker value, it tends to jump forward. This grass is important to have it placed here because the colors in this grass mimic the colors that we're seeing on the tree on the left. These are a lot more muted, they're less intense, but notice that the values of these colors are still much darker than the trees that we're seeing here in this background section. Also, the grass that we're seeing in this foreground has the most intense colors in the entire painting. And because of this, that grass is jumping so far forward that is kind of what our eye looks to. The trunk of this tree has a brownish gray color. So when we're going to be mixing these colors together, we're going to be mixing complementary colors with a touch of a little bit of red to give it that nice purpley warmth. Based on the observations we made, the best colors to use for this work is going to be a combination of ultramarine blue, light yellow, light orange, cyan blue, a little bit of leaf green, and crimson red. We may be adding touches of other colors in, but these 6 colors are going to be the main ones that we use to complete this painting. Now that we've analyzed and chosen our colors, our third step is going to be planning the order of our painting. Anytime you're painting a watercolor, you always build up the watercolor from light to dark. We're going to be using the technique wet on dry. So we're going to be building up our painting in layers from light colors first, letting them dry, and then every consecutive layer will get slightly darker until we meet these darkest values that we're seeing in the painting on the left. So the first step is we have to figure out, okay, where are the highlights? What areas should be left white? You'll notice that there are these arcs in the trees that are nice and white. These help define the different shapes of the trees that we're seeing. By keeping the highlights in will help us render our values more accurately because we'll be able to have a fuller range of value, and it lets our objects then look more three-dimensional. This tree on the left definitely has a lot of little white sections and light value areas we're going to want to have left inside there. Now, when wet paint is applied onto dry paper or onto areas of dry paint, the pigment will spread less than if you applied paint on a wet surface. This gives you more control over your brushstrokes and produces crisp edges, allowing you to achieve precise shapes, definition, and detail. which is perfect as this project is designed to help you improve on your observational skills of shapes, viewpoints, rendering, value, and color. To have initial success with this work, we're only going to work when the paper and previous painted sections are fully dry. So, you cannot move on in your painting. Like, we're going to be painting our sky first. You cannot move in on your painting until the sky and this water is fully dry. Once that's dry, then you can start to move on to the trees. Once that is dry, then you can start moving on to the grass and this tree over here. Once that is dry, then you can move on to maybe putting this grass in. And once that is dry, then you can start putting in the tree branches that we're seeing last. So it's all about planning and having patience between each layers of color. Because when you wait for the paper to fully dry, this is how you maintain crisp edges and control over where your colors are placed.
Before we begin painting, I want us to modify this outline drawing just to better help us paint in the sky. So the lines that I'm drawing here, I want you to copy on your own paper. I'm just modifying those chunks of leaves in there to get that shape better placed in so that the space in between the trees is more easily identifiable, for painting. The first color that we're going to be mixing is the blue that we see in our sky. Because it is so light, we're going to be adding a lot of water to it to create a tint. We're going to be using a combination of cyan blue and Prussian blue in about equal parts, and then add a lot of water to that pigment to make it a tint, and then test it out on the side of your painting, like in that empty space and border. Once you like the value of that sky and it matches the reference photo, then you're going to use this smaller mop brush with those brown bristles. It's your M Royal Soft Grip brush that has the letter CG995 on it. You want the brush to be kind of dry when you start. Just dip it into the pigment and then very lightly scrape it across the surface, leaving a little bit of white scrapes in between the pigment to where it almost looks like there's wispy bits of clouds floating through the sky. Paint in the section between the trees on the left and the right, going all the way down, moving your brush from left to right and right to left, almost like you're doing a flat wash technique. As you paint, reference the photo so you can see where you have pockets of sky showing up within the tree on the left. Once you have that sky painted in, you want to make sure that your values are in the right spot. I noticed that my values at the bottom portion of the sky were a little too dark. So what I decided to do was clean off my brush to where it was just damp. Then I took my brush and I'm actually lifting the pigment off of the paper using my nice clean damp brush. If that is not removing enough pigment to create that nice transition of values, you can dip your paper towel onto the color to better lift up any pigment. After completing the sky, go ahead and paint in the water that you're seeing on the bottom. We're going to do the same technique we did on the upper right-hand corner of the sky, where we're just scraping it across the surface to reveal some white streaks in between the blue streaks of paint that we're putting in. After painting in the sky and the water, let it dry and begin mixing your colors for the trees and the back right-hand side of the painting. Next, we're going to mix the color for the trees in the middle to right-hand side of the painting that are furthest from us. For this, we're going to do a combination of light yellow, cyan blue to make the green, but then to create a nice diluted version of it, we're going to add a touch of the light red to tone it down. You'll notice that the green that I end up mixing here versus the one that you're going to see me painting is going to get a lot darker in this next clip. And the reason is I just felt like it wasn't that nice tone. So notice how much darker it is. That's because I went in with a little bit more cyan blue and a little bit more red. Whenever I begin painting, I forgot to do a test sample and that initial color was too dark. So I just am going in with some nice clean water and I'm diluting that pigment by putting clean water around the pigment I just placed in to kind of help spread it out. Notice that my paper is dry before I paint this technique on. Now, to help render the shape of this tree and to help make sure that I'm rendering the value accurately, I'm making sure that my brush strokes are being placed in where they're curving around the tree, almost creating this radial look of a sundial where they're getting straighter when it's more vertical, and then as they come to the left, they become more angled. Pay attention to the direction of your strokes because that is going to help define the structure of your tree and the shape of the tree. But also pay attention to rendering the correct value by leaving the white of your highlights left on the paper. This means that you have to paint methodically and patiently. This is one of those times when you need to have that reference photo handy on your iPad. So I recommend doing like a dual screen right now on your iPad where you have that reference photo up while this video is playing so you can see, what I'm doing, but also just match what you're seeing in the reference photo because that's what's going to give you a clear depiction on what to paint. We are going to be painting this tint of a green into all of the trees that we're seeing on the right-hand side of the painting. Take your time, pay attention to where your highlights are, and make sure that you have a tint. If your first value is too dark, then blot it out with your paper towel to remove the pigment and then thin out the pigment more on your palette with water. You can do what I'm doing too, where like if a pigment has gotten too dark, you can thin it out with water directly on the paper where you're helping like spread that pigment throughout all the areas you're painting. But it's always best to have that perfect value matched on the palette before you actually put it on your final painting paper. You'll notice above this painting that I have a sheet of scrap watercolor paper that I've also taped down, and I'm using that to test the value of my colors before I paint them onto the actual painting. And this is going to help you create more accurate values and shapes because you're analyzing, okay, does it match what I'm seeing? You're taking the time to make sure that things are perfected, and you're just going to have a more accurate, better looking painting if you take the time to make sure that your values and the colors you're painting in are all done in the appropriate spot. For the tree on the left, the colors that you're going to mix for it are going to be a combination of ultramarine blue being the main one, and then adding touches of cyan blue and leaf green to kind of dilute that blue down a little bit more and to give it that more like greenish blue color. Make sure that you have that pigment watered down enough to make sure it's a tint, and always double check your value on that scrap paper. I always seem to be forgetting to do this on my painting. Now that ultramarine blue is going to be that main color because it is more diluted. The cyan blue and leaf green are more intense colors, so you only want to add that into the ultramarine blue sparingly. When you paint, same thing in this section, pay attention to the direction of the leaves. They're constantly changing within this tree, more so than the tree on the right. So you want to make sure that you're creating this like explosion radial effect in every single section of this tree because that's what's going to give that tree the more realistic depiction of its shape. Paint in carefully, making sure that you're not painting into the branches as well as the highlights in this tree. So go slowly. The nice thing is with the wet on dry technique that you want the paint to dry to create this layered effect. So it's not like you're rushing to get this whole entire thing filled before the paint dries. You can take your time with this, which is why we're doing this technique first because it allows for the most amount of freedom of mark making without, the worry of having the paint dry too quickly on us. So it's okay for the paint to dry as you're working on it. Once again, we're trying to focus on capturing good shape and rendering value with the appropriate color that we've mixed. So, notice how I'm leaving that nice big white highlighted gap in that billowing arc there on the left-hand side. I'm paying attention to the direction of my strokes. And if an area has gotten too dark with my strokes, I'm going back in with a little bit of water to dilute it, and then I'm pulling that pigment out from that too darkened section. After you finish painting the tree on the left, you're then going to have to use these same colors to paint in the grass on the right. Notice, and I forgot to mention this with the last tree, but I'm using my smaller rounded brush for this one. I'm not using the same brush that I did for this sky because this rounded brush creates more accurate depiction of leaves that we see in the painting than the other brush. If you use that big mop brush that we did for the sky, those leaves are going to just look too chunky and not small and crisp like we're seeing. When you're painting in the grass, paint them in as vertical strokes, and that's going to make that illusion of the grass is being placed there. Next, we're going to be mixing the really nice, bright, intense green in the lower left-hand corner in that grass. To create this color, we're going to be mixing light yellow and a little bit of Prussian blue to create that really nice, vibrant green. When painting in the green, you can start with on the bank on the right hand side. You'll see that really intense green is right underneath the grasses in that first tree. So go ahead and paint that in. Then when you paint the grass, pay attention to the direction the grass is growing in, as well as the value of that grass. I realized that was a little too dark, so I had to thin it out with some more water. Pay attention not only to the direction, but the length of your strokes. The length of the stroke should match the length of the grass that you're seeing in that area. Try to vary the starting point of all of your marks so you're not painting in rows of lines, but this very organic looking hatching marks with the paintbrush. Now, the one thing we can't forget is how this green is going to be reflected in the surface of that water. Anytime you're painting water, you want your strokes to stay horizontal. So paint in horizontal green strokes in the middle to right-hand section of the water before you move on to painting the trunk of the tree. The trunk, we're going to be combining the complementary colors of ultramarine blue and light orange. And then to give it that touch of like purple, we're going to add in a touch of the crimson red after we get a nice neutral that we've combined with the blue and the orange. And we don't want to add in too much red to make it a purple, but just enough to kind of give it that like purpley, bluish, grayish tone. When painting in the tree, pay attention to the direction of the bark. Notice on the right-hand side of that opening, the bark kind of curves around that hole inside the tree. It also then kind of spirals up into the left on the left-hand side, and then it goes on like that angle on the back left-hand portion of it. Those marks are going to be following that diagonal line as well. Pay attention to the movement you're seeing in here and capture it in the right spot, because these are cross-contour lines. So they define the surface characteristics of the form. So if the direction of these marks are in the wrong spot, then it's not going to make your trunk look very three-dimensional. To also help make this look three-dimensional, make sure once again you're leaving the highlights so we can have that full range of value. Our light source is coming from the left. So the left-hand side of all of these trunks and branches need to be left white. To create really nice thin lines, you only want to have a little bit of pigment on the brush. Make sure that you're using this pointed rounded brush, and then the branches should be getting thinner as you paint further out from the base of the tree. So to get those really thin little tiny branches that we're seeing in the reference photo, you want to barely be putting any pressure of that brush onto the surface of the paper. It's almost like you're trying to just like tickle the paper with the very, very few fibers of the tip of that brush. Do not paint in heavy and press too hard, or else your branches are going to look too thick. So I would recommend practice making some lines on that practice watercolor paper that you should have taped above this painting before you start painting in these branches on the bottom. But this is going to be the last step of today. Make sure your colors are correct, your values are accurate, and that you're leaving your highlights left so you have a nice strong foundation for the rest of your painting. Submit a picture of your work into the assignment Day 2 River Still Life painting, or not River Still Life, River Scene painting, excuse me, and then you will be graded on your work. Good luck, and let me know if you have any questions.